Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion and another video in the Whitlam dismissal series. This time I'm going to talk about the significance of a failure to pass supply and how the Whitlam government proposed to bypass some of its consequences through its plan to get the banks to fund the salaries of public servants instead on a temporary basis. When we talk about the Senate blocking supply in 1975, it didn't actually defeat the budget bills. Instead, it voted to defer deciding upon them until the government agreed to a general election. This was so that the coalition could retain control over those bills in the Senate and could pass them if it came to power. Public servants were sufficiently concerned about this tactic to advise the Whitlam government on the 2nd of October to put a clause into the bills so that they had to be returned to the House of Representatives before they could be sent to the Governor-General for royal assent. Now, this was to prevent Fraser from being able to guarantee to the Governor-General that he could provide supply. But Whitlam chose not to do so, which was again a strategic failure. The bills in question were Appropriation Bills number 1 and 2. They covered the running costs of government, including the payment of the salaries of the public service and the defence forces, as well as suppliers and certain capital expenses. Other payments, such as pensions and Commonwealth grants to the states, were funded from standing appropriations and therefore would not directly be affected by a supply crisis. But, as the Australian newspaper noted on the 18th of October, they could be affected if there was no money to pay public servants to process the pension checks and the grant funding. What would have been the consequences once supply ran out? On previous occasions in Australia, when supply was blocked in the 20th century, the dispute was always resolved by the holding of an election or the resignation or dismissal of the Premier. The only real experience of supply running out for a sustained period was back in Victoria in the 19th century. And I've discussed that in an earlier video, which you might want to go back and watch. However, during the lead up to the vote on supply in 1975, the National Times newspaper published an article on the 13th of October by an historian about the consequences of the blocking of supply in Victoria back in 1865 and 1877 to remind people about what had happened. It noted the numbers of innocent people who fell into the clutches of moneylenders charging interest rates of 50 to 100%, and the numerous insolvencies and suicides that were the consequence. The human cost at the time was horrific. Law and order was also seriously undermined due to the dismissal of judges, coroners, and police magistrates. At one point, there was a threat to dismiss all the prison warders and throw open the jails and the asylums. A functioning prison system was only just maintained, but for a period there was almost no one who could authorise arrest warrants of felons so that suspects, if they were held illegally. The flow-on consequences were widespread and unpredictable. While for some, blocking supply was really a political game of brinksmanship, there were others who would have paid a very real cost. There would also have been broader economic effects. These were explained by the then Treasurer Bill Hayden in Parliament on the 16th of October 1975. This is what he said, quote, "The economy of this country, if the present course of action which the opposition has set in train is pursued, will get out of hand. There will be a major economic collapse. A substantial number of enterprises in the corporate sector will fail. There will be an upsurge in unemployment, and generally there will be the worst deepening of the recession that we've seen at any time since the Great Depression of the 1920s. Aged persons hostels, aged and disabled persons homes, organisations for assistance to the handicapped will not obtain the money necessary to pay the people who provide the services. Hospital services will grind down. Education in the states will be short of some 360 million at least. People throughout the country will find that they will not be able to obtain their Medibank medical benefits," unquote. The Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, in a letter to the Palace on the 17th of October, was worried about what would happen when the money ran out. He reported that there were threats of protests, strikes, and industrial war, including from the unions. Kerr recorded that Whitlam's new Minister for Minerals and Energy, Senator Wright, said after he was sworn in that he was worried about the consequences of Whitlam's toughing it out strategy. He was concerned that there would be violence on the streets. Kerr noted that two other ministers had said similar things to him as well, but that the caucus nonetheless supported the strategy. There were also issues about legality and constitutionality. It's a fundamental constitutional principle that the Parliament controls supply and that this is a check on the executive government, forcing it to be accountable to Parliament. The Constitution requires that supply be passed by both houses before the government can draw and expend funds. Bypassing the Constitution by spending government money without the authorisation of an appropriation bill passed by both houses would be a major constitutional breach. Further, Professor Geoffrey Saw argued that if the government failed to meet its legal commitments to pay money under existing laws and contracts, it may be regarded as having fallen into illegality. Illegality was the ground for the dismissal of the New South Wales Lang Labor government, a matter of which the Labor Party remained acutely sensitive. Nonetheless, the prospect of illegal or unconstitutional action was inflamed by comments by the Deputy Prime Minister, Frank Crean, on the 19th of October. He said, "What is happening is unconstitutional. If it continues, there will have to be unconstitutional things done to stop the system breaking down." The Age reported that when asked if he meant that the government might use its money without Senate authority, Mr. Crean said, "That's right." He said that government would have to take unconstitutional measures to keep the administration functioning. Saw, however, pointed out on the 22nd of October that paying out money without an appropriation and a warrant from the Governor-General and the Auditor-General would be an offence under the Audit Act. On the 20th of October, Kerr wrote to the Palace outlining Whitlam's proposal to rely on the banks to pay public servants and Commonwealth creditors backed by a guarantee by the Commonwealth to repay the money. Kerr queried whether this could be done legally, but said that it would probably be tested in the High Court. He said that Whitlam claimed that there would be no constitutional crisis because Whitlam could still govern without obtaining supply, and that there would be no excuse for the Governor-General removing him and sending for someone willing to recommend an election. Again, this shows that Whitlam was well aware of the risk of dismissal for failure to achieve supply and that he was taking measures to try and avert it. The Palace response was simply that Whitlam's new tactic sounds ingenious, but they had no idea, they said, as to whether it would work. As always, this was a matter to be dealt with in Australia. So what was this bank scheme? You might remember from an earlier video that the Victorian government had used banks as a means of bypassing its loss of supply back in the 19th century. Its method involved the banks making loans to the government, which were then not repaid, and then the bank would sue the government, being awarded the amount owed by a court, and then being paid out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund, because an appropriation bill was not needed to pay out amounts that were awarded by a court. This was not the method used by Whitlam. Instead, he went for a much more complex and administratively difficult approach of providing certificates of indebtedness to government employees and suppliers. They would then present the certificate to a bank, which would pay out the relevant amount to the individual or business in exchange for receiving the certificate of indebtedness, which the bank could then use to be paid by the Commonwealth with interest in the future once supply was passed. Was it legal and would it work? Well, there were problems with both its legality and its practicality. This proposal, known as Scheme B, heaven only knows what Scheme A was, so Scheme B, was only presented to the banks for their consideration on the 6th of November. they had very little time to deal with the legal and practical complexities involved. At that meeting, they raised a number of concerns about it. One, the need to manage their own customers' needs before those of non-customers. Two, the fact that the scheme would run down their liquidity and force the banks to realise liquid assets, potentially at a loss. And three, that the banks would need to be indemnified against losses due to forgeries, fraud and theft, as the banks would not be able to verify claims made by purported public servants or suppliers. The banks also raised concerns about the massive workload they would assume in physically handling fortnightly payments to many thousands of people on payday, most of which would be in cash. The banks also regarded the scheme as impractical. The Commercial Banking Company of Sydney, in a pretty brutal telex to the Treasurer, pointed out that its interim position was that the scheme was based on assumptions of quite doubtful legality. It noted that a considerable amount of time and research would be required of the banks if the scheme were to be turned into an acceptable proposition. In what it described as the unlikely event that the legal barriers could be overcome, the bank noted that there would still be commercial realities, including pressure from deposit holders not to use their funds to support this scheme. The bank's managing director also pointed out that the banks were restricted under the Trade Practices Act from conferring with their competitors on the scheme in order to turn it into a proposition worthy of consideration, and that they would need to be certain that they were not going to be prosecuted for doing so. The manager concluded that if the government needed an answer before a proper scheme could be developed, the answer would be no. Most of the major banks participated in a meeting of the Australian Bankers Association on the morning of the 11th of November. They each tabled their respective legal opinions, as well as an opinion obtained from the ABA. For example, there was an opinion by John Lockhart QC that the scheme was fundamentally misconceived and that aspects of it were legally inoperable. All of the opinions expressed doubts and reservations about the scheme. In the course of the meeting, however, before final action was determined upon, they received word that the budget bills had been passed, so the scheme was no longer needed. The ABA nonetheless issued a press release stating that the government's proposals had been carefully considered by the banks individually. Their general position was that the proposals could not be accepted in their totality because of legal constraints and other implications, but that the banks would do their best to stand by their customers and support those affected. So in short, Whitlam's bank scheme was not going to work, at least without quite a lot of revision, and there simply wasn't time for that. Whitlam's own ministers were also sceptical about it. The Treasurer, Bill Hayden, later said in his autobiography, "I had large doubts, although I could bear with the proposal as a political bluff, a legitimate political tactic. I'm afraid I would have retreated from any effort to have it go much beyond that. In my view, this system could only function briefly and not happily, and would have broken down early in the new year." So yes, it was really just a bluff in a game of brinksmanship. Did it convince Kerr? Well, no. Kerr told the Palace on the 6th of November that even if the banks cooperated, the scheme would be messy and by no means cover all matters that fall within the appropriation bills. He thought that if it was implemented, it would be urgently challenged in the High Court. In a later letter, post-dismissal, Kerr explained that he had been told before he made his dismissal decision that at least some of the banks regarded the scheme as highly dubious legally, as an attempt to avoid the constitutional requirement of parliamentary appropriation, and most dubious on grounds of banking policy. He said he was later sent copies of the legal opinions obtained by the banks. He said his opinion at the time of making his decision was that no real substitute for supply would be available through the banks. This is reflected in the statement of reasons that Kerr issued on the dismissal of the Whitlam government. Kerr added a sentence at the end of that statement saying, "The announced proposals about financing public servants, suppliers and contractors and others do not amount to a satisfactory alternative to supply. He didn't expressly state why, but earlier in his letter he had stressed that parliamentary control over supply is a fundamental feature of the system of responsible government. It's the ultimate means for Parliament to hold the government to account. If governments could simply avoid the need to secure supply by doing deals with banks, a government could govern without Parliament and undermine the whole constitutional system. Clearly, this was not acceptable then and ought not to be acceptable today either. I say that because we now live in a world in which, at least overseas, we see a growth in populist governments rejecting the legitimacy of limits that are imposed by parliaments and courts. It needs to be remembered that the principles at issue in 1975 remain important today, and that the powers conferred on the Governor-General and the Senate are there to ensure that governments can't govern without Parliament or in defiance of the law. Whitlam seemed to believe that being elected to government and holding majority support in the House of Representatives gave him full power to do as he wished. Well, it doesn't. We have a federal system and a bicameral parliament for a very good reason: to prevent all-powerful governments. When people criticise what happened in 1975 and argue that both the Senate and the Governor-General should be stripped of their powers and that elected governments should reign supreme, they are unwittingly advocating a very dangerous course. It remains important today to uphold the separation and the diffusion of powers and plenty of checks along the way so that no one can gain total control. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion. Join me next time, very soon, because I have to get all these videos done before we get to the 11th of November. So join me next time for a video about the possibility of a race to the palace. See you then. Goodbye.